I tried to serve my wife first at dinner. My feminist daughter snapped, "Stop acting like a patriarch." The spoon was already in my hand when she said it. The table was set neatly, steam still rising from the dishes, the familiar smell of food filling the room in that comforting way it always had. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Nothing formal. No guests. Just us, gathered around the table we've shared for decades. I reached forward and began serving my wife first, the same way I've done for most of our marriage. Not as a rule. Not as a statement. Just as a habit shaped by time and care. That's when my daughter's voice snapped through the room. "Seriously? Stop acting like a patriarch." The word hit the air like a slap. My hand froze mid-motion, the spoon hovering above the plate. The clink of cutlery stopped. Chairs creaked as bodies shifted uncomfortably. The room went silent in a way that felt sharp rather than calm. I turned my head slowly toward her, genuinely confused. "What did you say?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression tight with irritation rather than surprise. "Serving her first like that," she continued, gesturing toward my wife. "It's performative. It reinforces outdated power dynamics. It's patriarchal." My wife looked up at her, startled. Then at me. Her eyebrows knit together slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, the kind that comes when something ordinary is suddenly treated like a problem. "I don't mind," my wife said softly. "He's always done that." "That doesn't make it okay," my daughter replied immediately. "That's how internalized stuff works. Women get used to things that don't actually serve them." The spoon in my hand felt heavier than it should have. I lowered it slowly, resting it back in the serving dish. "I wasn't making a point," I said. "I was just serving dinner." "And that's exactly the issue," she shot back. "Men doing things without thinking is how these systems stay in place." Systems. The word echoed in my head as I looked around the table. At my wife, sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. At the food cooling in front of us. At the life we'd built, now being flattened into a single accusation. "This is our home," I said carefully. "This is how we've always done it. And that doesn't mean it's right," my daughter said. "You're acting like you're in charge. Like she needs to be served." My wife shifted in her chair. "I don't feel like I need to be served," she said. "It's just something he does." But my daughter didn't look at her. She was looking at me. "That's the problem," she said. "You don't see how these gestures center male control, even when you think you're being kind." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but disbelief. I had stood in lines with this woman, sat beside her in hospitals, watched her carry burdens without complaint, served her first not because she was lesser, but because she mattered to me. Now that was being reframed as dominance. "I'm not in charge of her," I said quietly. "She's my partner." My daughter scoffed. "That's what patriarchy always says." My wife pushed her chair back slightly, the sound cutting through the tension. "Please," she said, "can we just eat?" But the moment was already broken. What should have been a simple routine had turned into a public correction. A familiar gesture stripped of its meaning and replaced with accusation. The food, the table, the room, all of it suddenly felt like a stage. I sat down slowly, the spoon no longer in my hand. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then someone reached for a plate. Someone else cleared their throat. Dinner resumed, technically. But something essential had been taken from the moment. As I looked at my wife, who now served herself quietly, avoiding my eyes not out of shame but out of discomfort, One thought settled heavily in my mind. If even care can be recast as control, when did love start needing permission to exist? The food tasted different after that. Not because it had changed, but because the room had. Every bite felt heavier, every sound louder than it should have been. Forks scraped against plates. Glasses clinked too sharply. No one spoke unless they absolutely had to. My wife served herself quietly, her movements careful, almost apologetic. That sight cut deeper than my daughter's words. I hadn't realized how exposed she felt until then. Across the table, my daughter sat with her jaw set, eyes fixed on her plate, as if the matter had already been resolved. Not discussed. Resolved. The certainty in her posture made it clear she believed she had corrected something wrong, not wounded something fragile. I watched her and felt a strange distance open between us. Not anger. Not hatred. Displacement. I was suddenly aware that I was no longer being seen as a husband or a father in that moment. I was being seen as a role, a symbol, something to be interpreted rather than understood. That escalated quickly, my son muttered, trying to lighten the mood. No one laughed. My wife glanced at him briefly, then back down at her plate. I could tell she wanted to say something, but years of smoothing over tension had trained her to stay quiet when conflict surfaced. She had always been the one to protect the atmosphere, even when it cost her a voice. And now, in a bitter twist, that silence was being mistaken for submission. "I just don't see why it's a problem," I said finally, breaking the quiet. "We've eaten like this for decades." My daughter looked up at me then, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "That's exactly why it's a problem," she said. "These things get normalized. They feel harmless because they've been happening forever." I nodded slowly. "And who decides which harmless things become harmful?" She didn't hesitate. "People who understand power." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing that. Power. It's a word that can flatten entire lives into a single dimension. In her framing, everything was vertical. Someone above, someone below. Control, submission, dominance. There was no horizontal space for partnership, reciprocity, or shared habit. "You think I'm asserting control by serving her first?" I asked. "Yes," she said simply. My wife looked up then, clearly startled. "Control," she repeated. "I've never felt controlled by him." My daughter sighed, exasperated. "Mom, of course you wouldn't feel it. That's how these dynamics work. They're invisible when you're inside them." That sentence hung in the air, heavy and dismissive. Invisible when you're inside them. I felt something shift inside me then, a quiet but firm realization. My daughter wasn't arguing with us. She was arguing past us. Our lived experience wasn't evidence to be weighed. It was an obstacle to be explained away. "So your conclusion matters more than her experience?" I asked. She frowned. "That's not fair." "It's exactly what you just said," I replied. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. But it passed quickly, replaced by resolve. "I'm trying to unlearn patterns that hurt women," she said, "even when they're uncomfortable to confront. And I'm trying to live in a home where kindness isn't put on trial," I said. Silence followed again. My wife reached for her glass, her hand trembling slightly. That detail broke something in me. She had done nothing wrong. She had asked for nothing. And yet she was carrying the emotional weight of a conflict that claimed to be about protecting her. "Can we please just eat?" she said softly. No one argued. We finished dinner in fragments. Small talk that went nowhere. Questions asked out of obligation rather than curiosity. When the plates were cleared, the relief was almost physical. Later, as I stood at the sink rinsing dishes, my daughter passed behind me. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," she said quietly. I turned to face her. "Then don't." She blinked. "I know what you meant," I interrupted gently. "But meaning isn't enough when it erases people." She looked away, clearly frustrated. "I'm not trying to erase anyone." "Then start by listening to the person you say you're defending," I replied. She didn't answer. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, my wife sat beside me on the couch. She leaned her head against my shoulder, exhausted. "I hate when simple things turn into battles," she said. "So do I replied. We sat there in silence, the television flickering uselessly in front of us. I realized then that this wasn't really about dinner. It was about how quickly love can be reinterpreted as something suspicious when it's filtered through ideology instead of relationship. And as I held my wife's hand, quietly, carefully, as if even that might be misunderstood, one thought stayed with me, heavy and unresolved. If every act of care must now defend itself, how long before people stop offering it at all? That night, long after the dishes were done and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, the tension still lingered like a low hum beneath everything else. My wife sat at the small table by the window, folding napkins that didn't need folding. It was something she did when her mind was busy, but her voice wasn't ready. I watched her for a moment before joining her, pulling out the chair across from her. "I didn't expect that," she said finally, not looking up. "Neither did I replied. She set the napkin down carefully. "I keep wondering when a habit became a statement." That question echoed exactly what I'd been feeling. Serving her first had never been a rule in our house. It wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't demanded or enforced. It was something that grew naturally over the years, the same way certain paths form in a garden simply because people walk them often enough. I did it because I noticed her, because I cared, because it felt right to me, and because she never asked me not to. I wasn't trying to prove anything, I said. I wasn't thinking at all. She smiled faintly at that. "That's what scares people now," she said. "Things done without calculation." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my hands together slowly. She talked about power, about control, like our entire marriage could be summarized by who gets served first. My wife shook her head. If that's the case, then no one looking from the outside could ever understand us. She was right. Our life together had never fit neatly into anyone else's framework. There were times she carried more than I did. Times I followed her lead completely. Times when we leaned on each other so heavily, there was no way to tell who was holding whom upright. Those moments never made it into theories. "I felt invisible," she said suddenly. That caught me off guard. "Invisible?" "Yes," she replied. "Not because of you. Because of the conversation." Everyone talked about what that gesture meant, except me. The weight of that settled heavily in my chest. "They talked as if I wasn't sitting right there," she continued. "As if I was an idea instead of a person." I reached for her hand without thinking, then hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. She noticed. "Don't stop," she said quietly. I took her hand fully then, holding it the way I always had. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what?" she asked. "For not realizing how quickly something meant for you could be taken away from you." She squeezed my hand gently. "You didn't take anything from me. They did." That distinction mattered. I thought about my daughter's words again. Patriarch. Control. Power. All delivered with confidence, with certainty, with the assurance of someone who believed she was standing on the right side of history. But history doesn't live in theory. It lives in kitchens, in shared routines, in habits formed slowly, over decades, without meetings or manifestos. I don't think she sees us, I said. Not really. My wife sighed. She sees patterns, not people. That sentence explained more than hours of debate ever could. I realized then that arguing facts or intentions wouldn't help. You can't compete with a worldview that treats lived experience as unreliable data. In that system, feelings are dismissed, history is reframed, and consent is overridden by interpretation. She thinks she's protecting me, my wife said. And in doing so, I replied, she decided you needed protection from me. The irony was painful. We sat there quietly, hands still joined, the house breathing around us. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. Life continued, indifferent to the ideological battle that had just erupted at our dinner table. I don't want to fight with her, my wife said softly. I don't either, I replied. But I don't want to live like everything I do needs a defense. She nodded. Nor do I. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep finally came. I thought about how quickly certainty can bulldoze tenderness, how easily people confuse challenging injustice with interrogating intimacy, and I understood something with unsettling clarity. This wasn't the last time something like this would happen. It was just the first time it had been impossible to ignore. The question now wasn't how to convince my daughter. It was how to protect our marriage, not from disagreement, but from being rewritten by someone who only saw symbols where there had always been choice. And as I finally closed my eyes, one thought followed me into the dark. If love has to explain itself every time it appears, how long before people decide it's safer to stop showing it at all? The next morning arrived without ceremony, but the tension came with it. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen counter, catching dust in the air and illuminating the same table where dinner had unraveled the night before. Everything looked normal. The chairs were where they always were. The serving dishes sat clean and stacked. But the room felt different, like a place that had been questioned. My wife moved quietly, preparing coffee, her back to me. I could tell she was thinking, not because she looked upset, but because she was careful. Careful in the way people become when they don't want to reopen a wound but haven't figured out how to protect it either. I sat at the table and watched her for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. She paused, mug in hand. "I'm wondering when I became someone people needed to interpret instead of listen to." That sentence landed heavier than anything said the night before. "I didn't know what to say," she continued. "Not because I agreed with her, but because it felt like whatever I said would be dismissed as part of the problem." I nodded slowly. That's how it felt for me too. She sat down across from me, wrapping her hands around her mug. "I've lived my whole life making choices," she said. "Big ones, small ones. And suddenly I'm told those choices don't count because they fit into a pattern someone else decided was harmful." Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about one dinner. It was about agency. About who gets to define meaning, the people living a life, or the people analyzing it from the outside. "I think she believes she's protecting you," I said. "She's protecting an idea," my wife replied. "I'm just convenient." That stung, because it was true. I thought about my daughter's certainty, the speed of her reaction, How quickly she had moved from seeing a spoon in my hand to seeing oppression at the table. There had been no pause, no curiosity, no moment of wondering whether the gesture meant something different inside a marriage than it might elsewhere. Context had been erased. History had been erased. Consent had been replaced by interpretation. Later that day, my daughter called. Her tone was controlled, deliberate. "I've been thinking about last night," she said. "So have we," I replied. "I don't want this to turn into a bigger conflict," she continued. "But I also don't want to pretend nothing happened." "I'm not pretending," I said. "I'm trying to understand why my care was treated like control." She hesitated. "Because these things don't exist in isolation. They do in families," I replied. "They exist inside relationships." She sighed. "That's where we disagree." And there it was. Not a misunderstanding. A fracture in how we saw the world. She spoke in systems. I spoke in people. She saw symbols. I saw habits shaped by love and time. And neither of us felt heard by the other. "I don't want to argue," she said finally. "I just want you to think about what these gestures communicate." "I have," I replied, "for decades. And so has your mother." Silence followed. "I didn't ask how she felt," my daughter admitted. "No," I said. "You didn't." Another pause. Longer this time. "I assumed," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "You did." We ended the call without resolution. No apology. No escalation. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something important had been exposed. That evening, my wife and I took a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool, the street familiar, the rhythm of our steps comforting in its predictability. "You know," she said, "if you had stopped serving me because of that comment, that would have hurt more than what she said." I stopped walking and looked at her. "I wouldn't do that." "I know," she said. "But I want you to know, I don't need protection from you. I need partnership." I took her hand then, openly, without hesitation. "That's all I've ever wanted to give," I said. As we walked on, I thought about how fragile moments of care have become in a world that rushes to label instead of listen. How easily intimacy is flattened into ideology. How quickly people forget that habits formed in love don't always translate into the power games they imagine. And I understood something clearly for the first time. This conflict wouldn't be solved by winning an argument. It would be solved by refusing to let someone else's certainty redefine the meaning inside our marriage. Because if we allowed that, if we let theory replace choice, then we wouldn't just lose a gesture. We'd lose ourselves. A few days later, my daughter asked if we could talk. Not over the phone. Not in passing. She wanted to come by. When she arrived, she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as if she were deciding which version of herself to bring inside. The confident one who corrects, or the quieter one who listens. I didn't know which would step forward. We sat in the living room. My wife joined us, but she stayed silent at first, sitting slightly to the side, observing. That alone said a lot. She wasn't positioning herself as someone who needed representation. She was present as herself. "I've been thinking about dinner," my daughter began. "So have we," I said calmly. She nodded. "I know it came off harsh." "It didn't just come off harsh," my wife said gently. "It changed the atmosphere of our home." My daughter swallowed. "I didn't mean to make Mom uncomfortable." "But you did," my wife replied. "And you never asked how I felt." Silence settled between us. I reacted, my daughter said finally, because I've spent years learning how these small gestures add up, how they reinforce expectations without anyone noticing. I leaned forward slightly. And do you believe your mother hasn't noticed her own life? That question stopped her. I'm not saying that, she replied carefully. That's exactly what you're saying, I said. When you tell her that her experience is invalid because it fits a pattern you've learned to distrust. She looked down at her hands. I see men doing these things all the time, she said. Opening doors. Serving first. Speaking for women. And everyone calls it kindness when it's really control. My wife spoke then, her voice steady but firm. You're right that some men do that. But you don't get to decide that your father is one of them just because the gesture looks similar. My daughter looked up, surprised. There's a difference, my wife continued, between someone imposing a role and someone participating in a rhythm we've chosen together. That word, chosen, hung in the air. I've chosen this life, my wife said. I've chosen this marriage. And I've chosen the way we care for each other. My daughter's certainty wavered. I didn't think about it that way, she admitted. That's what hurt, I said. You didn't think about us. You thought about what it symbolized. She leaned back, rubbing her temples. I'm trying to dismantle things that hurt women, and I'm trying to make sure the woman I love isn't hurt in the process, I replied. She looked at my wife. Did it really bother you that much? My wife didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer landed harder than any argument. It bothered me because I felt spoken over, she said. I felt like my feelings were less important than the conclusion you'd already reached. My daughter's eyes filled slightly, not with tears, but with realization. I never wanted to silence you, she said. And yet, my wife replied, you did. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was reflective. I think I've been afraid, my daughter said softly, that if I don't call things out immediately, I'm complicit. That fear, I said, is teaching you to move faster than empathy. She nodded slowly. I don't want to be that person, she said. Then slow down, my wife replied. Ask before accusing. Listen before correcting. My daughter exhaled deeply. I don't know how to unlearn everything overnight. No one is asking you to, I said. We're asking you not to overwrite our lives with conclusions that don't belong to you. She looked at me then, really looked at me. Not as a symbol. Not as a representative. As her father. I don't think you're a patriarch, she said quietly. That's a start, I replied. She managed a small, uncertain smile. When she left that evening, nothing was magically fixed. There were no apologies wrapped in bows. No declarations of transformation. But something important had shifted. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about ideology versus tradition. It was about respect. And as my wife and I sat together afterward, the house once again quiet around us, I realized something that brought a strange sense of peace. The conflict had forced us to articulate what we had always lived without needing to explain. Our care for each other was not unconscious. Our habits were not oppressive. Our love was not accidental. It was chosen, again and again. And no accusation, no matter how confidently delivered, had the power to take that away, unless we allowed it. I reached for my wife's hand then, without hesitation, without fear. She squeezed back, and in that simple, unremarkable moment, I knew we had crossed an important line. Not toward agreement, but toward clarity. After that conversation, something subtle changed in the air between us. Not comfort, Not closeness, but permission. Permission to exist without constantly defending ourselves. The house didn't suddenly feel lighter, but it felt steadier, like a structure that had been shaken and proven stronger than expected. My daughter didn't call for a few days after that. I didn't chase the silence. For once, I understood that space wasn't distance. It was processing. I noticed how much energy I had spent over the years avoiding friction, choosing peace over clarity, letting moments pass because confronting them felt too heavy, too tiring. That night at dinner forced me to see how costly that habit had become. Avoidance doesn't keep harmony. It just delays conflict until it hurts more. My wife noticed the change in me before I did. "You're walking differently," she said one morning as we prepared breakfast together. "Differently how?" I asked. "Straighter," she replied. "Like you're not bracing anymore." She was right. I wasn't scanning conversations for danger. I wasn't pre-editing my gestures. I wasn't wondering how everything might be interpreted through someone else's framework. For the first time since that dinner, I felt anchored in my own home again. That mattered more than I realized. A week later, we had another family dinner. Smaller this time. Less ceremonial. My daughter was there. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make eye contact first. I simply moved the plates onto the table the way I always had. When I served my wife first, I did it without hesitation. Not defiantly. Not provocatively. Naturally. The room stayed quiet. My daughter looked up, noticed the gesture, then looked back down at her plate. No comment. No sigh. No correction. That silence was louder than her accusation had been. My wife caught my eye and smiled, not proudly, not nervously, but warmly, as if to say, "This is ours again." Later, while clearing the table, my daughter came to stand beside me. "I noticed," she said. "I figured you might," I replied. "I didn't feel the need to say anything," she added. "That's growth," I said gently. She exhaled. "I'm realizing how often I confuse discomfort with danger." I paused, letting that land. "And I'm realizing," I said, "how often people mistake certainty for wisdom." She nodded slowly. "It's easier to be certain." "Yes," I agreed. "But it's harder to be careful with people." That seemed to resonate. We finished cleaning in silence. Not awkward, not tense. Just shared space. Later that evening, my wife and I sat together on the porch, the air cool, the world quiet around us. "I didn't realize how close I came to losing something," I admitted. "What?" she asked. "My confidence in us," I said. "In the way we moved together." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "No one gets to redefine that for us." I held on to that truth. I understood now that this wasn't just about one accusation or one dinner. It was about how quickly intimacy can be politicized. How easily habits born from love can be reframed as harm when people stop asking questions and start applying labels. What saved us wasn't argument. It was refusal. Refusal to internalize shame that didn't belong to us. Refusal to shrink in the name of progress. Refusal to let theory overwrite lived reality. I didn't need my daughter to agree with me. I needed her to stop assuming. And slowly, imperfectly, she was learning to do that. That night, as I locked the door and turned off the lights, one thought stayed with me, calm and certain. Love doesn't need to be loud, but it does need to be free. And in my home, at least, I was done asking permission to show it. The weeks that followed taught me something I hadn't expected. Not about my daughter. about myself. I realized how close I had come to changing, not in some dramatic way, but in the quiet, dangerous way that feels reasonable at the time. The kind of change where you tell yourself you're just being thoughtful, just evolving, just adjusting to the times, when in reality, you're slowly erasing parts of yourself to avoid conflict. That realization unsettled me. I began noticing it everywhere. Older men choosing silence at the table. Long married couples exchanging quick glances before simple gestures, as if checking whether affection was still allowed in public. People editing themselves not out of kindness, but out of fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being labeled. Fear of being reduced to a word. I wondered how many marriages quietly suffer under that pressure, not from abuse or neglect, but from constant suspicion imposed from the outside, from the idea that love must now defend itself before it's allowed to exist. One afternoon, my wife and I were invited to a neighbor's house for dinner. Nothing formal, just a few people, familiar faces, easy conversation. I watched her across the table as she spoke, animated, confident, completely herself. And I noticed something else. She was relaxed. She wasn't bracing. She wasn't careful. She wasn't waiting for permission to exist in the room. That told me everything. At one point, she reached for a dish that was just out of her reach. Without thinking, I stood and passed it to her. It was automatic, uncalculated, honest. No one reacted. No one corrected. No one analyzed. The moment passed the way moments like that used to pass. Quietly, humanly, without commentary. Later, on the walk home, she squeezed my arm. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "No," I replied. "And it felt normal again," she added. That word, normal, meant more than it should have. I realized then how abnormal it is to constantly question affection, how unnatural it feels to second-guess care, how exhausting it must be to live in a world where every gesture is a potential accusation waiting to happen. I thought about my daughter again, about how hard she was trying, how deeply she believed vigilance was a moral duty, and I understood something important. She wasn't cruel. She was afraid. Afraid of missing harm. Afraid of failing to speak. Afraid of being complicit through silence. But fear, when it drives every reaction, flattens nuance. It replaces curiosity with certainty. And certainty, when it moves faster than empathy, leaves very little room for real people. That evening, my daughter sent a message. "I've been thinking about what Mom said, that she chose that life. I don't think I've ever really asked her about it." I stared at the screen longer than I expected. That wasn't an apology. It wasn't agreement. But it was a crack. And sometimes, that's all change needs. I showed the message to my wife. She smiled softly. "She's learning," she said. "So are we," I replied. I realized then that the conflict had done something unexpected. It had forced us to articulate what we had always lived instinctively, to say out loud that our habits weren't unconscious, that our care wasn't inherited or imposed, that it was chosen, again and again, in small ways, over many years. That choice mattered, and I would no longer allow it to be reframed as something shameful. As I sat there that night, the house quiet, the familiar sounds surrounding me, one truth felt steady and unshakable. Love that survives decades doesn't need to be defended loudly, but it does need to be protected, especially from narratives that refuse to see the people inside it. And I was finally ready to protect it. The real test didn't come in a conversation. It came in a moment no one planned. A few Sundays later, my daughter invited us over for dinner at her place. It was the first time since everything happened that we were stepping fully into her space again. I could tell she had thought about it. The table carefully set, the food prepared ahead of time, the evening structured to avoid tension. I appreciated the effort. Still, I was aware of myself as we sat down. Not anxious, alert, curious about whether the progress we thought we had made could survive an ordinary moment without warning. When the food was ready, my daughter brought the serving dishes to the table. She placed them down, then paused. "Let's just serve ourselves," she said casually. "Whatever order." There was no edge in her voice. No accusation. Just a suggestion. I nodded. "That's fine." My wife reached for a serving spoon, then hesitated, smiling slightly. "You always insist on making a ritual out of everything," she teased me gently. "I don't insist," I replied. "I just notice." She laughed quietly, and without thinking, without announcing it, I took her plate and served her first. The room went very still. Not tense. Not charged. Aware. I glanced up. My daughter was watching us. Not with anger. Not with judgment. With something closer to uncertainty. As if she was standing at the edge of an old reflex, deciding whether to step into it or let it pass. She let it pass. She said nothing. She picked up her own plate and served herself, her movements calm, deliberate. That silence felt heavier than any argument we'd had before. But this time, it wasn't oppressive. It was earned. Later, while my wife and I were helping clear the table, my daughter leaned against the counter and spoke quietly. "I almost said something," she admitted. "I figured," I replied. "But I stopped," she continued, "because I realized I wasn't uncomfortable with what you did. I was uncomfortable with the story I used to tell myself about it." I turned to look at her. "And that story," she went on, "didn't include Grandma at all." My wife smiled gently. "I've noticed that." My daughter met her eyes. "I don't want to do that anymore." There was no dramatic apology. No emotional release. Just a clear statement of intent. And for the first time, I believed her. I realized then that what we had been fighting wasn't each other. It was a reflex, one trained by constant exposure to conflict narratives, by the idea that every interaction must be categorized immediately as either harm or resistance. Slowing down had broken that reflex. Allowing a moment to exist before interpreting it had changed everything. As we drove home that night, my wife reached for my hand. "You didn't hesitate," she said again. "No," I replied. "And she didn't accuse," she added. "No," I agreed. We both smiled. Not because everything was solved, but because something had finally shifted from tension to trust. I understood then that healing doesn't always arrive as agreement. Sometimes it arrives as restraint, as the decision not to react, as the courage to let people live their own meanings without immediately rewriting them. My daughter hadn't abandoned her values. She had learned how to hold them without using them as weapons. And I had learned something equally important. That protecting your marriage doesn't always mean standing your ground loudly. Sometimes it means continuing to live your truth calmly, until the noise around it has no choice but to quiet down. We didn't need to explain ourselves anymore. Our lives were explanation enough. I've thought a lot about that dinner since then, not because of the accusation itself, but because of what almost followed it. I almost learned the wrong lesson. I almost learned that care should be hidden, that habits built over a lifetime should be revised to avoid friction, That the safest way to love was quietly, cautiously, with fewer witnesses and fewer gestures that might be misunderstood. That would have been a mistake. What that moment actually taught me was something far more important. When people stop trusting lived relationships and start trusting only frameworks, intimacy becomes fragile. Not because love disappears, but because it's constantly put on trial. I didn't serve my wife first because I believe I'm above her. I didn't do it because I think she needs me to. I did it because after decades together, my body knows her rhythm before my mind does. That kind of care doesn't come from power. It comes from attention. What frightened me most was realizing how easily attention can be rebranded as control when context is stripped away. How quickly partnership can be flattened into hierarchy. How fast a life can be summarized by someone who hasn't lived inside it. But what reassured me was this: love, when it's real, resists being rewritten. My wife never once asked me to stop. She never felt diminished. She never felt owned. She felt chosen. And that distinction matters more than any label. My daughter didn't become a villain in this story. She became a mirror. She showed me how a generation raised on constant correction can forget to pause long enough to ask the simplest question: how does this person actually feel? She learned that protection without listening becomes erasure. I learned that silence in the face of misinterpretation slowly turns into self-doubt. And together, without ever announcing it, we learned how to slow down. Now, when I serve my wife first, I don't look around the room. I don't brace for commentary. I don't explain myself. I simply act the way I always have, calmly, deliberately, without apology. And the world doesn't end. Sometimes people notice. Sometimes they don't. But the moment belongs to us again. That's what was at stake all along. Not who was right. Not which ideology made the most sense. But who gets to define the meaning inside a marriage. I refuse to outsource that. Because if we start asking permission to show care, we don't become more just. We become more distant. And distance, disguised as progress, is still distance. So I'll keep serving her first when it feels right. I'll keep noticing her before I notice the room. I'll keep choosing partnership over performance. Not loudly, not defiantly, but honestly. And now I want to ask you something, not as a challenge, but as a reflection. Have you ever done something out of care, only to be told it meant something darker? And when that happened, did you change who you were, or did you stay grounded in why you did it? I'd like to know what you think.